going to be talking to you today about game theory and how you can use game theory for a defensive strategic advantage. A little bit about me. I just recently completed my bachelor's in computer science. However, I've been studying game theory since about 2016. It started when I started working in a red team environment, and I found that defenders were having a lot of difficulty straying from their standard operating procedures or their checklist and really trying to think like the adversary or outside of the box when it came to defensive posture. So I started a lot of research to try to figure out how I could bridge that gap and have defenders think more like the adversary. And what I found was that game theory was an excellent way to show the relationship between an attacker and a defender. And so these are some of the things that I learned that I want to pass on to you guys today. So the first slide, of course, is the why slide. Why should we even care about game theory? Real quick, I want to lay the foundation of what we're talking about when we say game theory. Game theory, in this context, I'm talking about the mathematical models that's used for optimal decision making between the interaction of two or more players. And probably one of the most famous examples of game theory would be the prisoner's dilemma. And this is a classic case where you and your partner in crime recently got arrested for a crime. You're divided between two different rooms, and you're told that you can confess or stay quiet, and depending on what decision you make determines what kind of prison time or freedom you might get. And this is a really good example of what game theory actually does, and that's create strategy. So instead of trying to rack your brain and try to figure out what your partner in crime is going to do, are they going to rat you out, or are they going to confess? Instead, you can actually create enough strategy to be able to know exactly, regardless of what your opponent is going to do, or your partner in this case, you can come up with an optimal solution. And this is really applicable to InfoSec because cyber attacks are not static. They're very dynamic. They're not always going to go through at the same point in the network. They're not always going to be the same type of attack vector. And so we can use game theory to come up with a proactive solution of how we can create a defensive posture instead of the whack-a-mole kind of reactive solution that we tend to do. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk to you about two specific game theory games today. I'm going to talk about the Colonel Blotto game and how it can be used for resource allocation, as well as the Flip It game and what I call the invisible compromise, and then wrap that up into some final takeaways and lessons on game theory. So getting right into it, Colonel Blotto game has actually been around for almost 100 years. It was first proposed around 1921 as a two-player zero-sum game. However, in 1950, in a Rand Corp paper to the U.S. Air Force, Gross and Whitener actually labeled it the Colonel Blotto game. I tried to find out why they named the paper a continuous drunken colonel game for the U.S. Air Force, but I couldn't find any information on it. I thought it was still funny nonetheless. Colonel Blotto game can basically be explained as a finite number. You are trying to protect a battlefield in which you have a finite number of troops over n number battlefields, and your attacker simultaneously has the same number of troops, but you don't know what their distribution is on where they're going to attack your battlefields. And we can basically break this down into four main knowns. The first one I just mentioned, the number of troops on each side is the same. The second is whoever has the most troops at that particular battlefield will win. 3, neither party actually knows where those troops are being distributed, so you don't know exactly where you need to put your troops in order to gain that advantage. And 4, both parties want to maximize the number of battlefields they win. Pretty simple, right? This is obviously a very simplified version of war or battle, but it does a pretty good job at really asking the ground question, which is, where are you going to put your resources? Now, on the picture on the left here, you have the Gross and Whitener 1950 solution, one of the solutions in which basically they situate all of their troops in a way so that they're all distributed evenly, but anytime there is a ramp up and attack in a particular place, they can all move very quickly, and so you can assign those resources into a place that it's needed in a very quick fashion. And that makes sense, right? So if we try to take this and we try to apply it to InfoSec, there's some main questions that we want to ask. First of which is, what are your assets? What assets need extra protection? Do you have any assets that need actually no protection at all? What is your normal defensive posture, and how does that differ from your high alert defensive posture? And why not be in high alert all the time? We're going to talk about a couple of those. When it comes to where are your resources, that's a fundamental question to have. But what I found is a lot of people don't necessarily go to the very first step, which is what are your resources? And if you were to ask just generically what your resources are in a company, usually these three things usually come to mind: people, time, and money. People in the form of employees, because at the end of the day, you still need people to run your operations. Even when it comes to an IDS, an intrusion detection system, we've made great strides in having automation in our defense, but at the end of the day, you still have somebody that needs to be on keyboard, whether it's adding signatures or gathering data. And so people are definitely a legitimate limited resource that you would have in your company. Time and money is kind of interesting because I always think about that as after the fact, when everything goes wrong, somebody always mentions time and money. Either, we didn't have enough time to be able to mitigate an attack, or if our budget was bigger and if we had more money, we could have bought X that could have helped us. These are all very legitimate things, but the idea with game theory is to think outside of the box. So instead, let's ask the question, what are specific resources that you use in InfoSec in your organization for defense? And I've mentioned two here, the first being tools. Tools back in the day used to be something that you always had that was just installed on your system. But today, when you have security as a service and IT as a service, what you're finding is that a lot more companies are using subscriptions. And you can buy a variety of levels of subscriptions that have different widgets that other lower pay might not have. And so this is something that you really need to keep in mind when it comes to your defensive posture, because you might have limitations that you weren't aware of. Particularly if you're using tools that use some sort of monitoring and data collection, you might have limitations on how much data that tool can store and parse through. And so that's very important. The second is bandwidth. And I'm not talking about necessarily your speed of your internet from 1990s, but what I'm talking about here is understanding how computationally expensive some of your tools might be that would affect your throughput of your network. An example of this would be DPI, or deep packet inspection. It's a great tool to use to really get some network analysis, but it is very expensive computationally. And so that's just one example of some things that you would want to consider when you're talking about your resources. So bringing it back to Colonel Blotto for a minute, what you often see in game theory, at the end of the day, like I mentioned earlier, game theory is about mathematical models. And so here you have two examples of math solutions that were created at the end of these papers. The one on the left being your 1950 Gross and Wagner paper, and on the right is a more recent 2012 paper in which a specific algorithm was proposed. And this is awesome that you actually have some mathematical answers, but the real challenge is how do you translate that to your sysadmins or to your IT department so that you can create real solutions when you go back to work. And with that in mind, I've listed two main strategic lessons here that Colonel Blotto can teach us that we can immediately use. And the first is to break down your resources into individual zero-sum games. So even though strategic, you think big picture, you can actually divide up individual issues or problems that you're having when it comes to defense into individual games. So instead of thinking about it as an attacker versus defender, you're looking at it more like malware versus IDS. And when you're able to do that, then you're able to look much more granularly at your things like resources and your limitations so that you can create a solution. The second is to use alerting and traffic flow analysis to know what your current threats are. Now, I'm by no means saying that you should somehow disregard your AV and all of the signatures that are in that. But what you can do is, by doing your own individual traffic analysis, you can figure out some of those cyber threat vectors that are specifically trying to get into your network. And so it's a great way to be able to know where you need to put your resources based on what kind of threats are out there and where they're trying to get in. So you've done everything that I suggested. You know your network perfectly, you know what all your resources are, what their limitations are, and all of your alerting. Awesome. You go through and you pull up your alerts and you have no major incidents, no bad guys on your network, right? Awesome. Then you can just go home and go collect your check, right? Not necessarily. What we're seeing more often today is that there are already entities on your network that aren't necessarily creating effects that have probably been there for a long time. In fact, in 2016, there was a FireEye report that showed that the global average dwell time between compromise and detection was 146 days. And so that's actually a long time to think that somebody would be on your network creating backdoors, exfilling data. And so we really have to ask ourselves, if none of this alerted on our system, but we have to assume that they're probably there, how are you going to defend against a ghost? And the answer to that is the next game that I'm going to talk to you about, which is Flip It. Flip It is a much more recently proposed game. It was proposed in 2012 in a white paper called specifically Flip It, the Stealthy Takeover. And basically what it is it's a blind version of Go. So you're moving to take control over your board, but the catch is you don't know when your opponent's moving or where they're moving. And this was created specifically to address advanced persistent threats, or APTs. So breaking this down into an explanation, it's still a zero game, a two-player zero-sum game like we talked about with Colonel Blotto. Players compete for control of a shared resource. You can move at any time taking control, but it is at a cost. So the other thing to this is, keep in mind both of you can be moving simultaneously. It doesn't have to be like a traditional game where I move and then you move. Each of you can move whenever you feel like that you need to move. However, it is at a cost. Who has control of the resource is not known until the person moves. So when you think about this from a network standpoint, basically when you're moving, you're checking the network and then you're mitigating the risk, so then you now have control of the network. And the objective, of course, is to have as much time control of the network with the minimal amount of cost. And we can see this through an actual Java implementation on GitHub that you can play. It's a 10-second game. You get 100 points for every second that you control, that you are in control, but you also lose 100 points for every time that you actually check or flip. And so my first thought in this is, okay, naturally, in a best case scenario, unlimited resources, what you want to do is be on your network all the time and constantly check your network, right? So that's what I did. Each one of these blue dots here is each time that I flipped, because I constantly want to make sure that I'm in control. So you see that red, because they're also simultaneously moving and flipping, they checked 5 times, right? So they took control 5 times, but for a very short period of time. So that's ideal on your network, right? Except for a key point in the Flip It game, which is that it comes at a cost. And that cost is your resources, because it's not actually probable that you're going to be able to have your best tools on your network on every single node at all times. And so it really drives home the point that you have to consider where you're going to put your resources and when you're going to use them. So let's look at a second example. Let's say you want to just look at your network periodically at the same time every single day, kind of like Patch Tuesday, right? Everybody knows it's coming. You can check your network and see if you're in control. Here you have red clicked flip much more times. They had a lot more control over your network. And so you lost this game. But keep in mind that it might be that you play this game several times and there are times that you will win. And in that same regard, in InfoSec, you can put in your policies, you can put in your standard operating procedures, your implementation of when you're going to check the network, and there might be times that you're going to win. But game theory really helps you to see that there are also times when you're not going to win and what you should do about that. And a big piece to this is the predictability of when you're actually checking your network. And so that drives home the 2012 paper solutions, or the lessons at the end, which were 2 ways in which you can win the flip it game. And that's with renewal strategy and with polymorphic adaptive play. And renewal strategy is really that piece of predictability, making sure that you're being a bit spontaneous when you're checking your network, when you're mitigating any kind of threats that are out there, so that the opponent is not also looking at your network and knowing exactly when to attack, because they know when you're not going to be on the network. The second piece of that is polymorphic adaptive play, and that's changing up exactly what tools you're using, how you're using them, and again, not being predictable. When this applies to InfoSec, I call it, I'm not the only one, but the moving target cyber defense is really at the heart of what we're talking about, especially when we're talking about adaptive play. I always think about horror movies in this example, because you always kind of know who's going to die when there's a chase, because you have the one person that's just running in a straight line. And so it's really predictive of where they're going, and also predictive that the bad guy's probably going to catch them and kill them, right? So zigzag is what I usually think of, because this is kind of a chase. You can think of it as a chase kind of game. And so some of those zigzags that you can actually make on your network that aren't necessarily inherent, are route changes, host address changes, OS host ID changes, and memory address changes. And while this might sound like it's something obvious, in my experience, I found that what most people do is they build up their network, they have those standard IP addresses that they use, those host addresses, and then they're like, okay, well, I'm done, let's move on to other pieces for my defense. But this can also be a part of your defense, because you got to think that your adversary is probably looking up plenty of things on the open network to try to find what they can find out about you. So who is records, any of those kind of things, they're going to be able to see some of this information. If you're changing it on a regular basis, it's just going to make it harder for the adversary to be able to pick out a pattern of life for your company. So bringing all of those games together, some of the main lessons that I want you guys to take home about game theory is, at the end of the day, game theory is a very broad subject about strategy. Anybody can use this. You can use this in some of your day-to-day life. You can take it to any kind of work, and you can find a way in which you're seeing that relationship between you and an adversary or opponent and finding that optimal decision. I very much encourage you guys to do some research on different games. In game theory, what you'll find is that there is a whole slew of games for all kinds of different scenarios. You're not going to find one particular game that fits your scenario perfectly that's going to give you all the answers. What you're going to have to do is look at these to help you think outside of the box, think of something new, think of something that maybe you're not already doing, that you just take for granted are facts in your network, and help that gauge what the adversary might need to do on your network. Bringing it back to Colonel Blotto, make sure you know your resources, make sure you know your network, understand your limitations and your resources. And then with Flip It, don't forget to periodically review, renew, and adapt. If you do want to learn more, which I highly encourage, I suggest the book Game Changer, Game Theory and the Art of Transforming Strategic Situations by David Adams. I felt that to be a pretty good resource, as well as Tim Roughgarden's Stanford lectures on YouTube, and also there's the link for the Stanford page. He has a whole semester's worth of lectures that really break down different facets of algorithmic game theory that I found particularly useful. Again, my name is Vanessa Redman, and thank you very much for your time.
Questions?
Hi, this is actually the second talk
there was another one yesterday that has brought up persistence, and you didn't specifically mention it, but maybe would you have a comment on the trend towards serverless and how that's going to impact persistence? I mean, that's the ultimate in adaptive, right? When you're not using it, it doesn't even exist.
It's true. I haven't done a lot of research on that serverless or your cloud services that are out there, but I definitely see that as being a challenge, because when you own your hardware and your software, usually it infers a certain amount of ownership, and so now you're relying on a third party potentially to do that kind of those kind of defensive actions, and that's a lot of trust, and so I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play out, but I'm certainly curious.
Have you applied, I like the game theory, especially when you're applying blue team, red team in some of the different games. One of the things that from a security engineering perspective, one of the things you have to do is threat modeling.
Yes.
Have you applied any of your thoughts around, well, these are basic tenets for threat modeling, this is how we can apply game theory on top of it to enrich how you assess your environment?
Absolutely. That's actually what I mainly use game theory for, as far as my own independent research, is I want to use game theory to help with cyber threat intelligence, and attack mapping is one huge part of that. And I think that game theory can absolutely be used for that kind of attack vectoring and threat modeling.
You mentioned the moving target and changing the posture to kind of try to fight that. At least from my experience, I found it being non-practical, mostly because of that IT teams don't want to break anything, and therefore, I mean, they're afraid to make any change. In lieu of that, what are your thoughts about using things like honeypots and perhaps deception techniques? Is that a good mitigation control for that or not?
I think that would be valid, but to me, that requires a certain amount of base knowledge that you would need, that you would assume that your IT department kind of has, and maybe a TAC teach would be necessary for that, but that would be a good procedural thing that could be implemented. I found that maybe making some of those changes, even though there is a fear of breaking something, that making those simple changes require a little less procedural thought and are just easier to kind of implement for the short term.
All right, and the last question.
Okay, thank you. And my question is about, from game theory, what is your opinion about building zero trust, the security? Yeah.
Zero trust is definitely a hot topic. I think that creating some zero trust mapping is definitely important and would be great to use, but I think that it's a bit harder on very well-established enterprise networks. The larger you are, I think it's a little bit more difficult.
Awesome. Let's give Vanessa a round of applause.